Okay, good evening everybody, and welcome to the public lecture series of this Cardiff School of Planning and Geography. We're absolutely delighted this evening to welcome Andrew Sayer to Cardiff. Those of you who don't know Andrew Sayer, he's been one of the most prolific, because he's such a modest and unassuming guy. He won't say this himself. It requires other people to say it on his behalf, as it were. He's been one of the most prolific and original social scientists in the United Kingdom for many, many years. This book that's been published, officially in London next week. So Cardiff, I guess, is hosting the world premiere of this book. I think we can say that. This will be Andrew's eighth book. And he has straddled an enormous array of subjects over that period. He's covered initially cultural and economic geography. He's covered radical political economy. He then moved on to social theory and moral philosophy. And this book brings together many of those different themes. His last two books, The Moral Significance of Class, was published, I think, in 2005. And in 2011, he published an incredible book called Why Things Matter to People, Social Science, Values, and Ethical Life. And I think he's brought those last two book themes of social theory and moral philosophy together with political economy in this extraordinary book that he'll talk about tonight. And I can't help adding a personal note. Andrew Sayer was my PhD supervisor at Sussex University, where we spent many, many happy and stimulating years together, working together at Sussex University. He's now in Lancaster University, and tonight we'll be talking about a book that's yet to be launched, and which is a very powerful book. So will you join me and welcome Andrew Sayer, please?
Thank you, everybody. The boy's done well, hasn't he? Let me apologise first that the book is not actually for sale that's happening next week, next Tuesday, in fact. But you're so ahead of the game here that couldn't do anything about that. And it's a great honour to be here. I love coming to South Wales, and I've never been overbooked before. I've been underbooked many, many times. I love coming to South Wales, not only because there's such a warm welcome in the valleys, as they say, and all that. Cliche, but that's true. But also because I sense there's a kind of different political atmosphere when I come here. It's kind of further removed even from the bit of northern England that I live in, from the mainstream sort of political values that you sense all around you. And I sense there's still, and I hope I'm not romanticising here, more of a sense of opposition to that mainstream. And but I came up with this title before I wrote the book 6 or 7 years ago, and when I ran it past friends, they all said, yeah, go for it, write a book on it. And it's so obvious that many people who you might not think of as political were appalled at what was happening to our societies, the way in which inequalities were widening, and what damage that was doing to the fabric of society, the way that those at the bottom were being stigmatized while money and privileges were being thrown to those at the top. And so many people are absolutely enraged by the suggestion that the welfare state is to blame for our situation, and the way that Labour doesn't seem to be willing to contradict that. And I think lots of people are astonished that our leaders, so-called, are doing virtually nothing about climate change. And we seem to be sleepwalking to runaway global warming. But that's talking to people who I hang out with, of course. And they're all members of what Owen Jones calls the biggest party in Britain, the shouting at the telly party. And but you know, I imagine if I told somebody from the 1%, particularly the higher reaches of it, I was doing a book called Why We Can't Afford the Rich, they say, politics of envy. Actually, this is not about envy at all. It's a big mistake to envy the rich. This is about the politics of injustice. It's about how our economic system dominated by the rich is deeply unjust, it's deeply dysfunctional for our economy, it's a threat to democracy, also because of with wealth goes power, it's bad for our well-being, and it's completely unsustainable. Now, I promise not to show too many graphs, but there is one, and maybe many of you may know this one. This data produced by Thomas Piketty and Associates over the last few years, and it's not that up to date, it only goes up to 2011, but it goes back to the end of the First World War, when, as you can see, the 1%, their income was nearly 20% of the national income. And then in the interwar period, it fell, and especially in the post-war boom, the golden era of capitalism, the most successful era of capitalism, also the most equal, when they only got slightly less than 6% of national income at one point. From which point, roughly the Thatcher years, it's climbed up with the neoliberalism coming in. And yes, it does take a dip after the crash, but all the indications are that it's soaring upwards again. And just to bear that out, it is actually, I guess a lot of people know that wealth is concentrating at the top, but it's hard to realize, appreciate just how fast it's happening. Let me show you this. This is the collective wealth of the 1,000 richest people in the UK from the Sunday Times Rich List. And you see 1997, 98 billion. And then it grew to 2008, 413 billion. It took a dip after the recession, well, in the financial crash, but it bounded back. And in the last year, it put on 15% growth. So it's now 519 billion, just owned the wealth of the 1,000 richest people in the UK. And I couldn't believe this. I kept going back to the figures. And I thought, well, how can we make sense of this? Let's look at some other big numbers, like state spending. Well, state public expenditure is only slightly more than 519 billion. Pensions is 143 billion a year. And the national health, our dear national health, in intensive care or not, oh, no, that's completely inappropriate, isn't it? 127 billion. Oh dear, what are we going to do with the NHS? Where are we going to get 8 billion from that it needs? Well, as the Americans say, well, go figure. And last week, well, the other week, the deficit was estimated to be 100 billion. That's 100 billion we're borrowing mostly from the rich and rich organizations. Should we be borrowing from them and paying them interest, or should we be taxing them? That's I thought of setting that as an exam question. But now, the key distinction in the book is an old one. It goes back to the 18th and 19th century, classical political economy, very important in the history of socialist thought, very important in the history of taxation. And this distinction has been forgotten just at the time when unearned income came bounding back in the last 30, 40 years. What do I mean by these terms? Earned income is conditional upon producing some kinds of goods and services. They're not necessarily marketed goods and services. They could be something which isn't marketed, like a school maths lesson, for example. And in getting a job and getting an income, that's conditional upon you producing or contributing directly or indirectly to the production of goods and services. I'm not saying that what you get in terms of pay is equal to what you contribute. That's usually not the case, actually. But I am saying it's conditional, and if it's a capitalist firm, they're not going to employ you unless you're going to do something good for their profit line. Okay. But unearned and extracted income is derived from the ownerships of key assets that other people need, and the most obvious one is land. Land is not something people create, it's already there. And if I successfully claim ownership of a portion of land that other people need, I can charge them rent for it. And that's unearned income because I haven't created anything that wasn't there in exchange. So by controlling key assets, and there are other ones besides land, you can extract income from people without contributing goods and services at all. That's unearned income. And it's kind of there in your tax returns. And it's based upon control of key assets that other people need. Okay. And I think we need to recover a lost vocabulary. And the key word here is actually rentiers. Well, you could pronounce, I don't know why they pronounce it in French still, but rentiers is just as good. Same thing. And those are people who get most or all of their income from unearned income. That is, through controlling these assets, which you can charge people for using, because they don't control them. And lots of the writers the last 150 years, 200 years, were critical of this. Property without function, for example, improperty. Because property with function is property that you use for your own use, for your own needs, like your houses. You use them for living in. If you buy another house, say, buy to let in order to rent out to someone else, in order to make money, that's unearned income. You know, the functionalist investor, Ilf Ruskin, I like that one. And as we know, Marx didn't do euphemisms. I don't know whether you've been following this news story, the New Era estate in London, which is a council estate built in the 1930s, but a charitable trust, and it's in the East End, and it's close to the centre, and it's actually got working class tenants, either retired or doing the jobs which keep London going. And it's been recently taken over by a consortium which initially included Richard Benyon, the richest MP in the Houses of Parliament, 110 million he's supposed to be worth, as they say, worth. That's his pile in Berkshire. And what they're doing is pushing up the rent by about 4 times, roughly 4 times. And the tenants, the New Era tenants, have been very strong in campaigning and got this into the news. And social housing, not social cleansing, and social cleansing, very appropriate term, because especially those of you who do planning and geography will know it's driving these low-income workers out of the city to where? Well, there just aren't other low-income housing possibilities open to them. So they're in big trouble, but they're protesting. Now, it's interesting, Benyon has withdrawn under public pressure from this consortium. It's interesting that he also is very much in favour of the bedroom tax and very much down on the welfare state. So he kind of joins up a lot of dots, doesn't he? And his family claim to have been in the area of London for 150 years. Oh, I'm sure we should be very grateful for them for that. He's withdrawn. Westbrook Properties, the New York firm, actually more aggressive rentiership, you could say, who are continuing it and pushing up the rents faster. Anyway, what is important is not the individuals, it's the mechanism. This is John Stuart Mill in 1848, and you may have come across that first quote, landlords grow rich in their sleep without working, risking or economizing. But actually, in a way, the next bit, can you all see this? Says more. Maybe people say never read out what's on the PowerPoint, so I'll let you read it. Have a glass. Okay, so to paraphrase it, if I get £10,000 in rent from my buy-to-let properties or something, and I've paid for all the maintenance and so on, anything above that is pure rent. And so if I got £10,000, that £10,000 only has value if there's some goods and services I can buy with it. So somebody has to produce that. And the people who produce it are producing a surplus over and above which they can get themselves. And he very nicely puts it, it comes from the fruits of others' labours, which those other labourers, don't receive. So Mill wasn't the first one to say this. Tom Paine, of course, earlier on, before that, even Adam Smith said, landlords love to sow where they have not reaped. And pretty much the same message from Henry George, the American reformer, anti-rent and so on. And I know it's risky and quite reasonably risky to mention Churchill in South Wales. But he did say one or two good things. And one of them is that he said, rent is a payment not for a service rendered, but for a disservice rendered. And I think it actually is quite right. Okay. And now, just changing the topic slightly, one of the most extraordinary things is the way in which words really matter in economic. When it comes to economic matters, they carry a huge political baggage. And this is something missed almost completely in John Lancaster's latest book on money, The Language of Money. Investment. Who would not want to be called an investor rather than a speculator or a gambler? Who would not want to be called an entrepreneur rather than a capitalist? These are political terms, and they're contested, but investment is an extraordinary term. It sounds so great, doesn't it? I'm an investor. Oh, thanks very much. And it can mean wealth creation. You can picture somebody funding and building a wind farm, a school, a hospital, getting in some new technology which makes life better. Great, of course, how could you not approve? But there's a completely different meaning which has become more common, which is about the wealth which you can get in various ways, wealth extraction. So we expect to get something on our savings, maybe above the rate of inflation, hopefully, and the trading financial assets, that's called an investment. You know, somebody comes to say to you, let me invest some of your savings for you, and I'll give you and that means let me get you a gain by some means. You've no idea whether this connects to any real investment because it doesn't have to. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you're extracting wealth in a project which is connected to actually creating something new in terms of improving the production of goods and services. Sometimes not. Isn't it amazing how we slip between these two meanings? How the first one serves as a cover for the second. And we have to ask, where's this coming from, this wealth and this extraction? Where does it come from? It comes from somewhere. But of course, especially in the financial sector, 1 billion from the first source is no different from 1 billion from basically gambling. It's just 1 billion. Who cares? But it does matter for the economy. Sorry. You may have heard about this place as well. This is Hampstead, Bishop's Row, the second or first richest street in the country, and it has scores of these mansions. I don't know whether you can see, but there are security grills in all the windows because it's empty most of the time. And about a third of the houses in this street, some of them bigger than this, are empty. Some of them never occupied. And so going from the top right, it's got security grills, another one, and it's got an Aston Martin with an Arabian number plate. So that's obviously just for there when they pop over sometimes. Some of them are empty, some of them are derelict, top left. But who cares, because maybe they want to change the land use in future. And it's increasing in value, not thanks to anything they've done, but thanks to development gain, which I'm sure many of you know about, and other developments, real investments like investment in the Crossrail link, cost billions. That's benefiting loads of other people who are getting a free ride, including these. And the one in the middle is one of many houses in this street which has been demolished, the garden scooped out to put in a basement, whatever it is, extra room, swimming pool, whatever. And they put the garden back, then they rebuild the house exactly the same. That one's just been rebuilt. And you might like to know that these notices on the hoarding tell us about how green the construction company is in recycling. Thank you. But you may be saying, well, hang on, this house price inflation is something which has become part of life, isn't it? Some people bank on it, you know, their pensions depend upon it, you know. And that's true. So a lot of homeowners are perhaps unintended, the getting a windfall, not as a result of improving their house, but they may have done, but over and above that, their house goes up in value. Maybe they can cash it in by downsizing or some other means. And that's unearned income, frankly. So lots of people are encouraged to be small-time rentiers, and they may borrow money to become small-time rentiers from big-time rentiers. There's a kind of chain of unearned income going up. But yes, it does mean that this helps to legitimize this, of course, the fact that lots of other people are doing it on a small scale. But it's how can you claim to have earned this? Now, rent isn't the only, been enjoying Scrabble recently. Rent isn't the only source of unearned income. There are many, but interest is very important. Even though we perhaps don't think of it as unearned income, we think of it, we deserve it, we've saved. Yeah, we should get some interest. But think of this. Say you're extremely hard up, you've hit bad times, you need £1,000 quick. You've got a friend who's comfortably off, and you know that it wouldn't be any trouble to them to lend you 1,000. So you say, please, can you lend me £1,000? And they say, yeah, okay. It'll be 5% interest, compound. And if you default on the payment, I shall take possession of goods to the value of your debts. That would be the end of the friendship, obviously. Yeah, neither a lender nor a borrower be, obviously good advice. But why would we think that's so outrageous? Because they would be blatantly taking advantage of our weakness. They're using their strength to take advantage of our weakness. And I put usury there quite deliberately because I think we should talk less about debt and more about usury, because that signals a relationship between lender and borrower, not a thing, debt. It's a relationship. And all the old critiques of usury, whether secular or religious, go back millennia. And the most important point they make against is it allows the rich to dominate the lives of the weak, take advantage of their weakness. And that still applies. You know, you think of rich banks and super rich individuals, bondholders of Greek bonds and so on, disciplining the lender. The borrower. That's millennia old, that story. It's not new. But of course, there's a kind of cultural transformation with debt. Instead of thinking of debt as a burden, oh dear, how can I get rid of these debts? In a stroke of genius, they renamed it credit. Oh, I'm credit worthy, how nice. They think I'm successful and reliable. Oh, so good. And you know the Wonga phenomenon, over £5,000 of 5,000% annual APR, and the owners of that making 50 million in the first few years of it. And it's extraordinary how indebtedness has increased. And this is a kind of usury, and there are all sorts of forms of discipline applied to the failing borrower. But, you know, again, what's that for? What's the interest payments for? We know that poor countries which borrow from rich countries end up paying more back, far more back than they borrow. What's the interest for? What's it a payment for? And this is German data now. Going from left to right, those 10 bars, and 10 black, 10 grey, 10 white, sorry, they go from on the left, the poorest 10%, the next 10 poorest 10%, right up to the richest 10%. Okay? Population divided into 10 in terms of households. And the black bars are interest paid to the household, interest they managed to get, say, on their savings. And the white ones are payments out of interest to others. And you can see how this siphons wealth up to the top. It's obvious, really. Most lending is by people who don't have much money. People have a lot of money to people who don't have much. And they pay interest. So, not surprisingly, and it's only the 10% who are in surplus. Actually, it's within that is mainly the top 1% and the higher reaches of it. So this is an extraordinarily simple mechanism by which wealth goes up. And it's unearned income, I would argue. Now, I think one of the things we really need to do, and it's become a necessity, such as the seriousness of the crisis, is to challenge taken for granted institutions, economic mechanisms and institutions. And this is the institution of tradable shares. So you or I, if you've got the money, we can buy, say, some Marks and Spencer shares. And who does the money go to? It doesn't go to Marks and Spencer's, it goes to the previous owner of those shares. It may help push up Marks and Spencer's share values. Yeah, it may not. So I expect dividends, depending on the kind of share, and increasingly shareholders demand more and more, of course. And I expect speculative gains from buying and selling the shares at various the right points of time. All that's unearned income. What's it for? It's not actually likely to fund any real investment. Maybe if you buy some new shares, then yes. But they're a tiny percentage of share deals, tiny, and decreasing proportion. So let me ask you to think, why are these uncommitted fly-by-night, if you like, or fly-by-the-second shares are traded by the millisecond these days? They're uncommitted shareholders. Why are they treated as the prime stakeholders of firms? And why are people who work in them, maybe for decades, who are often very committed to work that they do, not just a source of money, but to the work and the service they're providing, they are not stakeholders? That is absolutely astonishing. What is the justification for that? Why aren't we asking that question? And you could say consumer reps also should be key stakeholders, and maybe committed investors who do actually fund some objective investment too. They should be in there as well as stakeholders, but not these uncommitted ones. The functionalist investor, as Keynes called him. Now, I've been talking about rentiers who get money in their sleep, but in the day as well, of course. And some of them call themselves the working rich these days. They claim to work extremely hard. Well, so what? Care workers work extremely hard. Salary earning, most of their money comes from salary. So how can they be rentiers? Surely that's earned income. Well, most of the super rich and rich who get their income mainly from salary are in what I would call working for rentier organizations, like many financial institutions, not all perhaps, property firms, and lots of non-finance firms these days actually are quite making a lot of money in the financial sector. So part of their money, at least, is unearned income. They're rentiers at one remove, but they get the money in the form of salary. But the firm's revenue comes from interest and from speculative gains and so on. And we should, part of the book is arguing against the idea that markets are meritocratic. You know, you're worth what you're paid and you're paid what you're worth. And the market gives you a measure of that. Markets, as even Hayek said, the founder of neoliberalism said, have got very little to do with fairness. He acknowledged this. He actually said maybe we shouldn't tell our children, as it might discourage them from trying hard, because there's a lot of luck. You know, he was honest about maybe being dishonest with his kids. But anyway, markets are not meritocracy. It's very much down to power and control of assets especially. And when it comes to explaining why, say, top managers and owners get so much, the simplest explanation, and usually the right one, is simply because they can. And anything more than that is just whitewash. You know. And the situation is worse, and partly, of course, because labour has been weakened. Labour organisations have been weakened, anti-trade union legislation, industries running away to countries with cheaper labour and so on. Okay. So there's a shift in power which also explains it. But the working rich, that's a concept which is bandied about a lot. To justify what's going on, we should question it. Okay. Now you may be saying, well, some of the rich are surely deserving. Steve Jobs was, who his income was 8.3 billion, it's his wealth, sorry, and James Dyson 1.45 billion. How do we get our heads around those numbers? Well, if you were paid £1 a second, it would take you 88 years to get to 1.45 billion. If you're paid $1 a second, it would take you 266 years to get to Steve jobs is wealth. Now, yes, these are innovative people, but we need to puncture this myth of the maverick kid in the garage who's such a brilliant individual who invents all these things. A lot of the inventions come from the state, actually taken up by private firms, and people don't invent things or develop things on their own. They stand on the shoulders of people who've worked on things before. They work in teams of mostly unacknowledged contributors, and the whole workforce is from the young kids producing tablet computers in China through to the design specialists. And yeah, they are, exceptional people perhaps, and perhaps they should have more. But the reason why they get so much is primarily to do with ownership. It's within their power by virtue of ownership or partial ownership to control what happens to the revenue brought in by the work that the employees do. It's in their power, so it's because they can. I think what we should do is allow employees to vote for the salaries of managers. Okay. Where there is wealth, there is power, and it's tempting to stick at this level, toffs, basically. The rule of the rich is plutocracy, and there's top left, is David Cameron, and the third at the front is Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, or Berlusconi, and Michael George Osborne, rather. There's a lot to say about all that, but let's look at what's underneath, which is more important. First of all, there's a kind of structural power where rich individuals and organizations control the commanding heights of the economy. They control particularly the financial heights. This is why the financial sector have, escaped certainly being imprisoned and also being restricted much in the aftermath of the crisis. But there's a whole lattice, which I try to explain in the book, of networks between lobbyists, think tanks. There's consultancies, jobs for politicians and so on. So-called researchers who are donated to ministers by leading companies which help to draft legislation, including accountancy firms specialising in tax avoidance. And Labour Party employs somebody called Chris Walsh, I think, from Oxford, who's a tax avoidance specialist. So he's advising Ed Balls. Isn't that nice to know? Political donations, so important, is argued in the States by Neil Ferguson, who wrote that Inside Job book, which I recommend, that the two political parties now have to be pretty much the same on economic policy. All they differ on is social and cultural policy. Why? Because the only way they can get funding is to get funding from big business. And so, Goldman Sachs and Microsoft will be funding, and Google fund Obama as well as the Republicans. Whoever's going to win, they can only win if they get their agreement. Tax havens, an enormous topic, but they are actually sponsored by places like the City of London. The City of London, as Nicholas Shaxson has shown, is a centre of a web of tax havens, which they very much are determined to preserve and expand. Maybe most of you know about TTIP, this Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Tell everybody about it, because this is such a threat to democracy. This is a trade pact which is being negotiated in secret by corporate lawyers. Very few elected members of our representatives know anything about it or are party to it. And what it most worryingly includes is mechanisms by which big firms can sue governments for blocking what they want to do. So employment legislation, health and safety, and environmental legislation. And this is already going on in other parts of the world governed by other trade pacts. In Ecuador, the mining company Occidental is suing Ecuador $1.4 billion, I think it is, for being refused permission to do some mining for environmental reasons. If that goes through, then what happens to democracy? It'll be purely nominal. I think we live in democracies, and it's very important, but we're in democracies which are in the shadow of plutocracy. And legal corruption, what do I mean by that? Well, we know about illegal corruption, and this sentence from Frédéric Bastiat, the French political economist, I ran this past some people in the Tax Justice Network, the kind of investigative researchers working on tax avoidance. I said, is it too strong, this? And they said, no, that's absolutely it. What is either not illegal, it hasn't actually been tested in a law court, or what is actually legal in some cases, is actually a form of corruption. I'm not going to say anything about philanthropy, that's just a bit of bait, because I consider philanthropy to be part of the plutocracy, part that legitimizes it. But you can take issue with on that with me if you like later. I'm not going to say much about this, other than that we shouldn't be cowed into remaining silent on the wasteful consumption of symbols of opulence by the rich at a time when so many people are needy. The 85 richest people, Oxfam tell us, in the world have as much wealth as the poorer half of the world's population, all 3.5 billion. Is that a rational allocation of resources? I want to ask the economists. But it's a waste of labour, it's a waste of resources, it's a waste of time. And of course, there's another side to it. And it involves more than just the super rich. You know, this Christian Aid poster, we've done a few really good ones. And yes, this is important. Our carbon emissions are important. And not just the rich, but many of the people, most of us in this room, I imagine. And can we afford our lifestyle? Well, we can't really, can we? But it's very easy to responsibilize, as they say, individuals, you know, go for your low energy light bulbs and so on, and feel good about it or whatever. It's our responsibility. Well, yes, it is. But as Mike Berners-Lee, written some very good books on climate change, argues, what's happening is that if we're the addicts when it comes to carbon, we're addicted to high carbon consumption, and we're being told to get off our addiction, while the dealers, the energy companies, are being boosted by the government, being funded by the government. And of course, they're huge firms. They have immense power. And 1/6 of our pensions, the value of our private pensions, or those who have private pensions, I should say, it is only just over half the population. 1/6 of those private pensions are invested in BP. So they have clout. But are they going to do anything about it? Can you read the caption on this cartoon? I think it's great. This is a board meeting. Can you read it over there? Do you want me to read it out? Okay. Over there? You can see it? No, they can't see it over there. This is a board meeting, and the chair is summing up. And so, while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. Well, I mean, that's completely on the nail, isn't it? And what you might be thinking so far, all this stuff about unearned income, it's payback time. That's the big message. And what we need is growth, and with redistribution from the rich to the rest of us. Well, yes, but for the fact that all those issues are completely trumped by global warming, which is a more pressing issue. Maybe we can come out of the economic crisis, but unless we do something about global warming, then we're really in trouble. And irreversible trouble, possibly. And I call this the diabolical double crisis of economy and climate, because the apparent solution to the economic problem is a resumption of growth with some redistribution, partly to get that growth. Then everything will be all right. Well, no, a resumption of growth will boost consumption, particularly in rich countries probably, particularly of unsustainable consumption. But on the other hand, So that will precipitate a climate disaster. On the other hand, actually reducing consumption, at least amongst the better off, in order to reduce carbon emissions, and I don't believe in green growth as a possibility, don't believe you can have 2%, 3% compound growth forever and cut carbon emissions at the same time. It's ridiculous. So this is a really inconvenient truth, yes, and for people like me, who are comfortably off. University professors are in the top 10%, 5%, so I have to admit it. Not the 1% though, at least not many of them. But if we cut back consumption and stop growth, which is what some people are arguing, that will really scupper the capitalist economy and we'll be in big trouble. So this is hugely difficult crisis, and what do you do in a crisis? Well, you have to go back to basics. And one basic way of thinking is this: how much can each person in the world emit in terms of carbon emissions, where you take the capacity of the Earth to absorb CO2, and it's about half the CO2 we're pumping out at the moment, and divided by the world's population, then you get a figure per person. And anybody who's richer than that, or emitting more, has got to come down to the sustainable level, and anybody who's below it can move up to it. That's contraction and convergence. And I think we definitely need it, obviously, between rich countries and poor countries, but we also need it within countries. And that will be good not only for climate, but for more equal, more socially just societies. So, equalization. But that's very difficult to imagine. It's hard to imagine how we could ever politically achieve this. But unless we do it, frankly, we're promising our children runaway global warming and what goes with that. So we're in this crisis, and what you have to do in a crisis is go back to basics. And this sounds hopelessly idealistic, but on the other hand, it's hopelessly idealistic to think that something will turn up and rescue us, you know, some miracle technology and so on. And we have to ask, what is an economy for? An economy is for provisioning people with the wherewithal to live well. That's the point of economics, of an economy. The economy is there to serve us, not vice versa, which is what a neoliberal economy is, what a capitalist economy is, what a neoliberal university is. It's to serve the economy, and so on. And it should be fair, it's socially just. It should promote well-being. We have to think about what is well-being. Is it just consuming more stuff? It has to be sustainable, ecologically, environmentally sustainable. And we've got to ask questions like, well, what is wealth? And I don't think it's a kind of poetic indulgence to take Ruskin's suggestion that the only wealth is life. Life in all its richness, I think it was, he said. Life is things like, obviously, well, being able to live with security without the threat of violence of any kind, being able to develop your capacities and so on, and being able to take part in the running of the community if you want to, and so on. We're social animals. What kind of beings are we? We're social beings. We need each other. We also need some autonomy, and we need to negotiate that. And we need to think about things like competition. Well, competition can be good, yes, it can raise standards, and it can also produce a race to the bottom, a drive to climb up the greasy pole of league table rankings. You know all about that. That becomes the point of life, to get higher up the league tables in the university, isn't it? We've got to rethink these things. What is life about? There's a cultural side to this, in other words, there's an ethical side. And the good news, if you like, when some good news coming, well, the good news, many of you will know, particularly from reading the work of Richard Layard on happiness and the work of the Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickerton, the Spirit Level book, that actually, above a certain threshold, meeting basic needs and so on, people don't become happier with more and more stuff to consume, more and more income. Other things matter more, like friendships and feeling recognised and supported and enabled and all that kind of thing, and contributing. And that threshold is actually higher than many people. Some people haven't achieved that in this country, but it's not only about the threshold, it's about the kind of society that we live in. Is it one which drives us to regard ourselves as competitors with the next person? It's me or them, sharp elbows and so on. Or is it one where we actually flourish by cooperating? We've got to think about all those things quickly. So it implies different ways of life. One where getting the latest stuff, the new stuff, isn't the main point. And if you want more basic suggestions, more specific suggestions, I'm just going to put these up. Because I haven't got time to talk about them, but I thought it'd be best, because if you're thinking, oh, don't give me this waffle about well-being, give me some policies. Well, these are the kind of things. And some of them actually could be agreed upon by quite a number of people, I think. Actually, most of the 99% need not be hit by a wealth tax. Remember those figures I gave you on the wealth of 1,000 richest people. We've got to stop the TTIP, and control movements of capital if we want to control economic functioning. We need massive investment in low CO2 energy. But that's it, basically. So, there you go. Thank you very much.